Attention, human scum. You are listening to the Sirens of Audio.
G'day audiophiles, this is the Sirens of Audio, the show that explores the universe of Doctor Who in the audio medium. I'm Dwayne.
And I'm Philip. G'day Dwayne, g'day audiophiles.
Well, g'day. And it's my great pleasure to welcome back a guest who was with you, Philip, on your first episode of this illustrious podcast.
Yes, he's taken him 200 episodes to come back again.
G'day Richard, how are you?
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me. Yeah, I'm sort of okay. I am recovering from COVID, but I'm doing all right. So yeah, not bad at all. Thanks.
How's things going over there on the Something Who podcast?
Yeah, I mean we've had, I think, probably pretty good year last year. Not quite so many releases, but all of them good. I mean, really enjoyed speaking with Gary Gillett, former editor of Doctor Who magazine, Toby Haydock. But we've also, been doing a few episodes of just the regulars. Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing is we're having fun with it, which is the key thing.
It comes across as you like having fun.
Yeah, and also it forces me to watch Doctor Who, and I do actually enjoy watching Doctor Who, but sometimes it gets pushed to the very corners of my life. So when we're doing a podcast about a particular story, it gives me a chance to watch something, and that's fun too.
That's very interesting that you raise that topic, because I'm going to delve a little bit more into that with you in just a moment. But before we get into our reviews for today, I should let our viewers and listeners know that this episode is what we like to call...
We've got randomoids.
Yes, it is. And today we're going to be looking at the stories picked for us by the Big Finish Randomoid Selectatron, namely The Game and a companion chronicle called the... Now, Philip wasn't able to say this the other day. Can you say it for me, Philip?
The Anachronauts.
Beautiful. You were struggling with it the other day. Now I'm struggling with it today.
It's anachronistic. The Anachronauts.
Yes.
Acronauts in the UK. No, that's something different.
So we're going to have a look at those two stories in a little bit more detail. Plus, if you stick around for the Anachronauts, we are going to be chatting with the writer of that story, Simon Guria. So we recently had a chat with him about that, and we'll be sharing that with you too. But before we do, Philip, do you know what?
What do you want to do, Dwayne?
I want to very much jump down the rabbit hole. Let's go. Okay, this brings me, Richard, to something that you brought up. Now, I've been listening to Something Who for a long time, and regularly you get jided for the fact that you do a Doctor Who podcast, but sometimes when you talk about the episodes that you're discussing, you say, well, I haven't seen this one since 1983. It's been good to go back to this one. I'm very curious about your fandom, because I know for me, I've watched these episodes that you talk about over and over and over again since my teenage years, and even beyond that, or younger than that. What is it about you and not watching these episodes so much that, and you continue to be so interested in Doctor Who?
Okay, it's a perfectly decent question. So I became a fan very young. I'd say probably about 5. From the age of 5, I was watching Doctor Who avidly. What turned me into a real fan probably was Target books. Started reading the Target books at age 7. This is sort of 1975, so we're talking Tom Baker on the telly, all the John Pertwee novelizations, some of the early Tom Bakers. So yeah, that I suppose was where I started out. So you could only watch the episodes once in the UK, or maybe twice if they repeated them in the summer. So there wasn't much of an opportunity to watch again at that point. We got a video recorder in the house right at the end of 81. So Davison was the first time that I could have done multiple watchings, and I did. So I'd say between the 1982 and when I left home in 1986, I recorded and watched Davison's, Colin Baker's, and whatever else was shown on the telly. And I did it, and I suppose the early VHSs were coming out, Seeds of Death and so on. So I watched a fair chunk of Doctor Who in that time period. And then, look, I mean, I have been a fan ever since then, but it's one of the things that I do. And I would say probably between 86 and 2013, it was probably reasonably well hidden in my life. I mean, I got excited about Big Finish, and we'll talk about that later on, and also the return of the new series. But yeah, I mean, I would avidly watch the programs, but probably once, maybe twice. Yeah, so it's not that I wouldn't watch them multiple times, but I just have so many other things I'm trying to get through as well, that I don't have a lot of time. But yeah, as I was saying earlier, the podcast gives me the excuse, I suppose, just to find time in my schedule to go and sit down and watch it. And invariably it's fun. So that, I suppose, is my feeble explanation.
Is your memory good as well, Richard? Because my memory is a bit more pliable, and I sort of forget things a lot more. So I have a tendency to go back and rediscover things. Whereas, are you someone who has a vivid memory of what you've read and watched?
Well, I'm not going to say that I'm quite at Ian Levine levels of recall. I'm pretty good, but I probably have a worse memory than I imagine. I mean, I generally I'm pretty good, pretty approximate, I suppose, with my memory. So I often go back and check just to make sure that I have remembered it correctly. Like quotes and stuff. I generally get the sense of it right, but I may not get the actual exact words. So yeah, I mean, but having said that, we'll discover when we talk about the game that I must have listened to that back in the day. It didn't leave a massive impression on me. So it was almost like listening again for the first time when I listened to this week.
Was that similar for you, Philip, or were you more of a consume it over and over type of person? I don't think I've ever asked you that before, actually.
Well, I think as we've mentioned, up in Australia, we had it on every single night.
True.
So we just watched it over and over and over again. When I forced my parents to buy a VCR player in 86 it was, when they started repeating the Patrick Troughtons. So we got the Mind Robber on video, and then they went forward. So I've got everything on video from Mind Robber onwards. And I've still got all those VHSs done. So I watched it over and over. I mean, the most recent total watch I did was as the complete Doctor Who history came out. The complete history of Doctor Who came out issue by issue. I'd watch all 3 or 4 stories in that and then read the book. So that was over a couple of years. I did every story again. And at the moment, I'm working my way through Peter Capaldi again. And there's lots of, I've got to go back and do some more classic stuff soon. So I'm always watching something.
I did miss out, now I think about it, a couple of significant chunks. So I got cable TV for the first time in the late 90s. So I was able to watch all of the programmes on UK Gold. So I saw most of Hartnell and Troughton for the first time in the late 90s. I mean, obviously having known the stories for a very long time by then, but never having seen them, or never having seen most of them. And then I also did a complete watch through to early Tom Baker with my daughter in the sort of from about 2013 onwards. So I watched most of those early stories a second time with her at that time. So yeah.
When you go back and watch something now that you haven't seen for a decade or a couple of decades, does your opinion ever change of them? Do you actually have gone back and gone, wow, this is really fantastic, or boy, that was garbage?
Yeah, well, we watched The Doctor's Wife recently for Something Who, and I hadn't seen that since the first time it was broadcast. And the first time it was broadcast, I went away with it thinking, didn't think too much of that. Watched it this time, I thought, oh wow, that's really brilliant. So yeah, I mean, sometimes that does happen, and I suppose it particularly happens when you're in the middle of a series and you're sort of bombarded for 13 weeks with stuff. It's perhaps easier to be blasé about something than when you're going back and hearing it on its own.
Yep.
Very good. Well, I was just curious to know a little bit about your Doctor Who viewing habits and how you felt about the stories after that time. So thanks for sharing. Appreciate it.
No problem.
All right, let's scramble our way up out of the rabbit hole, and we'll talk about the first of our two random Big Finish episodes that have been picked for us, and we'll start off with The Game. Now, before we hit the trailer, I'm going to read the blurb, but I was going to try and do it in Ray Warren's voice.
Give it a try if you really want to.
Give it a try? Ray Warren? All right. No, I don't think I can. My voice doesn't sound anything like his, but anyway, I've got to do it in that style, all right? Here's the blurb. On the planet Krei, it's game time. The Gora and the Lenine are set to face off in the grudge match to end all grudge matches. The players are limbering up, the commentators are preparing, the fans are dabbing themselves in their team's colours. The arena is set and the kickoff is approaching. When the Doctor and Nyssa arrive, however, they find that Naxi is a sport that anyone can play, whether they want to or not. Krei's entire future depends on the match's outcome, but the time travellers soon realise that anything... I just stuffed up the last line. But the time travellers soon realise that it is anything but just a game.
Doctor Who. The Game.
Now, what I usually say at this point is that the world as you know it is about to come to an abrupt and utter demise, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to prevent it. Right, that's out of the way. Is anyone else hungry?
Good afternoon, Naxi fans, and welcome to the Match of the Day, sponsored by Majestic Tyres, the Kings of the Road. Wherever you are, we're happy you could join us because it's a beautiful day for Naxi. Take it, man! Charles, you know what I'm saying? You're soft. Weak. Official results from yesterday. We outscored the Gora 340 to 291. The caving coach. In another few weeks, we'll be Naxi champions. There's the whistle, and today's match is underway. The Gora are making straight for their foes. And there's the first elimination. That didn't take long. I can't quite see it.
It was Favre.
Sorry to cut you off, Skipper, but we have some action in the backfield. One of your rookies is in the thick of it.
Oh, that's the Doctor.
Uh-oh, he really has his hands full now. Trem Belloc's coming out to back up Sakis. Look out! Oh!
I want to go to you first, Richard, because you said earlier that the game didn't leave much of an impression on you. It was the opposite effect on me. What were some of your memories returning when you were re-listening to this, if any?
Jonathan Pearce is a football commentator in the UK.
He'd be like the Ray Warren of the UK.
Yeah, I guess. And actually, I mean, the last, 20, 30 years, he's been a BBC commentator, so a bit more moderated, but he started out on other channels, and he was quite dramatic. That was his style, was to be a bit more of the people or fanny, I suppose, in his commentary style. So he was familiar to me, and I thought, that was quite a nice touch that they'd actually got a proper commentator in to do it. As soon as I heard him, I remembered, oh yes, I remember that aspect of it. I'd say that until I started listening to it, I remembered absolutely nothing about it at all. And then as we got going, some of it came back to me. And in particular, I was generally about an episode ahead of most of the twists, but I don't know whether that's because I remembered them or just because they were telegraphed. What was your impression on this story, Philip, going back to it?
Well, I remembered none of it whatsoever. So I know when you put it out, you said the game, and I was sort of nonplussed because I knew the image of the cover, but I could remember nothing at all about what this was about. And even after it started, I still remember nothing at all about it. So, I felt like it was the first time I listened to it. Which, interesting. But I really enjoyed it. It was not what I was expecting, but it was better. So, yeah. What about you? What did you remember in terms of going back to it? You say you remembered it well for the first time.
Oh, yeah. I loved this when it first came out, and nothing's really changed. In fact, listening to it again, I got an even deeper appreciation for it in my own mind. Because I was such a huge fan of Seinfeld, one of the things that stood out to me was the fact that this was advertised as the Seinfeld writer coming in to do a Doctor Who episode, or one of the Seinfeld writers. He didn't write too many, but he was one of them. So that really stood out, and I've never forgotten Darrin Henry as a result of that. I'm curious as to know why he's never done anything again, because this story I thought was really good, and I thought it would be worthy enough for him to be invited back to write again for Big Finish. Maybe that was a one-off. Don't know.
There's lots of one-offs around this time, though. It's amazing how many one-offs there were. Because
this is also getting towards the end of Gary Russell's time.
Yeah.
And then Nick Briggs had his own vision with his own writers that he wanted to take on. That we know that Nick Briggs even, cancelled a lot of stories that had already been commissioned when he took over. So perhaps Darrin Henry was one of those that was going to come back and never did.
He was quite a big name. He would have been very busy. I mean, he's an American. So just in terms of people may not know who he is. I had no idea who he was.
Yeah.
I had to go looking for it to work it out, to find out who he was. And I hadn't realized he was American. I hadn't realized he's mainly a television person. And he's actually done a lot of American TV. He's written some entire series. So, people may not be aware that, he has a very huge backlog of catalog of TV programs, and is actually very well known in America.
So his wife as well was in it. She was playing the Ambassador Faye Davis. She was the American accented person. That's his wife. Yeah, and she's famous for being in the
wife team that Gary's put together.
I'm not a fan of The Office, the American version of The Office, but she stars in that apparently. So
it's a bit like Don Houghton then. You've got the writer and the actress.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
And just looking through the cast list too, there's Robert Kirbishley's in there. He was in Chimes of Midnight. Ian Kubiak. He's quite up there in sort of recognisable in terms of fandom, isn't he? Ian Kubiak. He does lots of interviews. I think he's done a Mythmakers or two recently, actually. So he was in there too. Did you notice in the cast list, it's not, I don't think it's listed on the app version. I didn't pick out the physical CD for this. But Steve Berry is listed in there as a cast member. He's playing a robot butler, which I think only appears near the start of the story. I wonder if that's our Steve Berry at Big Finish Marketing. Did you pick up on that, Phil?
I wouldn't think so, because I get the impression, I don't know, I get the impression our Steve Berry is actually quite young, but this is a long time ago, but I might be wrong.
He still could be quite young compared to us, Philip.
I'm quite
We've
young.
Been around a while.
What you say.
Of course, the big feature of this story was the return of William Russell, and it was kind of making the whole Mordrin Undead thing, where he was supposed to appear next to the Fifth Doctor, a reality. Not that he was playing Ian Chesterton, but he was opposite the Fifth Doctor for this story. So, what were your thoughts on William Russell and his performance in this, Richard?
I liked William Russell, and it's a nice part for him. I mean, and it's very different from Ian Chesterton. It's very much its own thing. So I enjoyed the performance. The note that I made about it is, and I don't know whether this is going to cross the cultural gap, but he's the intergalactic version of Hong Kong Phooey, in that he turns up and everyone thinks he solves the problem, but it turns out that actually it was the cat all along. He's that was quite a nice twist, I thought.
Well, Darrin Henry has written for animations like Futurama and stuff like that, so he may have got inspiration from Hong Kong Phooey. Very well could have done.
Who knows,
what were your thoughts on William Russell, Philip?
Well, that's why I have no memory of this, because I would have thought I would have remembered William Russell was in this. So I have it. It's on my shelf. I'm not sure whether I don't know whether I even listened to it. So yeah, I had no memory of William Russell being in it. But then I'm not good with, I'm never good at looking at cast lists anyway. So I may have just not picked it up. The thing that surprised me was how old he sounded, because he's done many things since here. A lot of because this was one of the first times. Maybe it was the first time he returned to Big Finish. Because back then Gary was getting original cast members to come in and play different roles. And so there's lots of different roles people are playing. But what surprised me was how old he sounded, because a lot of stuff he's done lately, the Companion Chronicles, the First Doctor stuff, he sounds much younger. So the last time he appeared was in Susan's War, and he was sounding old in that. He was really struggling. You could hear that in Susan's War. I'm so glad we got that story, because that Sense Right story with Carol Ann Ford and William Russell playing Ian is just amazing. But he sounds old. But in this, he sounds old. I think he actually must be putting it on, because he's supposed to be an old character. But yeah, as I said, the thing that struck me was, boy, he sounds old, because most of the Big Finish stuff we have, William Russell doesn't sound old.
Well, he might just be not putting on his Ian Chesterton.
Yeah, I think I'm saying I think he was deliberately acting old and putting it on. But it was just hearing him now, that's how he sounds. It was just interesting that 20 years ago, he was sounding. I think he was acting it then, but now he actually is that.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So he would have been in his late 70s, I suppose, at this point. I was watching the two things in the last couple of days. So one was the making of the Edge of Destruction from probably about this era, 2006. I think they released the DVD, and it's got William Russell and Carol Ann Ford on it. And William Russell is very with it and chatty, and there's not very many revelations, but you can see that he's really on it. Whereas I was then watched the interview that he did with Matthew Sweet on the recently released season 2 box set. And I mean, I'm not saying that he's not all there, because he is all there, but you can tell he's having more difficulty in accessing his memories. He's not as fluent, I guess, in his discussion. So he definitely. I can see what you're saying, Philip. He seemed a different man back in the sort of mid 2000s.
Yeah. So I think it's a great acting job, because he's putting on old. It was just, for me, it was just a bit sad he put on old, because that's where he is now.
And Richard, what about the story itself? How did that appeal to you?
The only thing I'm going to say about the story that's a negative, I think, is the mechanics of the game. I couldn't quite get my head around that. Essentially, what they're saying is that there's tens of people dying in each match, and these strikers are sort of getting rid of hundreds of people in the course of a season, and yet they're somehow managing to survive themselves. I mean, even in combat in the Middle Ages, when I suppose some warriors must have survived until their old age, they weren't having battles every day. It sort of felt, I just couldn't quite see in my mind's eye how that was going to work, unless there was some kind of thing where there were people protecting the star strikers or whatever, and then they were sort of somehow able to emerge from that protection and do what they had to do and then come back. That aside, I thought it was, it was obviously. I was going to say that it was talking about the Premier League and where football had gone wrong in the UK, but this is an American writer, so I don't know if it necessarily was about that. It kind of felt like it was about that, because we're sort of 15 years at this point into the Premier League in the UK, and it had sort of become a monster where only a few teams could ever win. But I suppose maybe it's also a satire on American football or basketball or any of the popular US sports too. For hockey, ice hockey, perhaps they do talk about it as being like a hockey stick, don't they?
I was thinking just that just north of, because Darrin Henry lives in New York, so just north of there you've got even probably New York too, you've got all the ice hockey around there, and that is quite violent, just with wooden sticks, let alone sticking some blades on them. So if you think of an ice hockey game, that's probably what I would visualise more than soccer. I guess it's the English accent and the commentator that makes it sound more like football. I really enjoyed this story, and it just reminded me that things have changed a lot, even in Big Finish. Like the level of sort of gritty violence that you get throughout this story, I don't think, because when was this released? 2005. So the new series was just starting. So I'm sure around this time is when the BBC were starting to get more and more interested in what was contained within Big Finish. Prior to that, they weren't really interested at all. So I think Big Finish could get away with a lot more. So I think it was quite hard hitting, some of the violence in this. Did you pick up on that, Philip?
Yeah, it was definitely bloodthirsty. And once again, the Doctor leading a charge to try and escape, which ended up turning into a massacre of the other side by mistake. And just the Doctor being forced onto the killing field was an interesting choice, which once again, it'd be hard to see them making today. So I think you're right. I think the BBC weren't watching it the same way back then as they do now. And because the death count in this is just dreadful. It's huge in terms of people dying in it. I do think it's trying to be very experimental, which we actually kind of meet the Doctor becomes the first River Song in one sense, because there's all these peace talks that the Doctor we've worked out his soul beforehand, and he will be going on a journey to 24, 26 different places to actually bring about peace, because he finds out that's what he needs to do at the end. So that lovely little time twist, which is something that's become more common in the Moffat era, was actually done long before Moffat was around. So this is before any of the timey-wimey stuff. We have our first big timey-wimey story. And one of the things that Big Finish used to do really well, and actually still does well, is play with time. Because the original classic series Doctor Who never actually used time. Aside from getting the Doctor to a place, it's very, very rare that time plays any element in any story. It's just about getting somewhere and then getting out and having a story. Whereas the new series, it's become quite obsessed with time stories. This is an early example of what you could start doing with time. You don't see it happen, but you know the result of what's going to happen. And I think the pairing, Peter Davison does a really good job. It's one of his better jobs in terms of, it doesn't feel like he's throwing it in. He's really putting in some real work and emotion. And Sarah Sutton, as always, is just superb. She always gives everything, and she gives emotion. And if it weren't for her, she just holds these stories together. I do understand why Peter Davison thinks Nyssa was the perfect companion, the Doctor, because we keep seeing it in Big Finish. I do think she's the ideal companion. She's a moral compass. She's a great sounding board. She's intelligent, but she can still get into danger because she's young. So I think she plays all those elements work really well together. And the other thing I think the story does really well, which is it has a moral base without being preachy. Because the thing that I struggled with the Chibnall area was just they had to hit you over the head with what you had to believe morality-wise. This is a morality tale. It's anti-war. It's the dangers of violence. It's the need to find ways of finding peace. But you're not being preached at. It's just a story that unfolds, and that's all is part of the story. And so no stage, even though it is actually quite a strong anti-war polemic, you're not being preached at. And I love Doctor Who that has real points. You can discuss the polemic behind it, but you don't get preached at. And I think this nails all those things really well.
It's interesting you bring that up, and I think this story is a great example of Doctor Who that does have a political point, but it's got a political point that, unlike much entertainment, even it's crept into Doctor Who these days, you have to pick a side. You don't have to pick a side with this story. Everyone can see it, and everyone can agree with it on different levels. So whatever your political view, and that's what I love, and I think that's what helps makes it not preachy. If you can get people of all sides to look at a story rather than try and get your audience to pick a side, I think that is much more entertaining. You agree with that, Richard?
Yeah, I do. I was also just chewing over. I mean, it's released in February 2005, so it's just ahead of the new series. Philip was saying, is it possible that they weren't looking all that hard? I don't know. I mean, perhaps Russell T Davies and the team are sort of so focused on getting their new series out. But I suppose also that once the new series is out, and people are viewing that, then maybe they're more careful about the tone of these Big Finish audios, and perhaps, less so when this was commissioned, I suppose, at some point in 2004. But yeah, no, I agree. I mean, clearly there's an issue here about money, about marketing. So they're kind of, I suppose, digging into that aspect of things. But yeah, it doesn't feel like it's making a party political point. It's more, as you say, it's more complex than that.
I mean, we could certainly have a discussion based on arms races, capitalism, advertising, because all those things. I mean, it's a really clever idea he's come up with, where it's the losing team that gets to market the winning team. And so if you're actually winning too much financially, you're in trouble, because you actually need. So the way they maintain this war so it doesn't end is by using money, which is, of course, why most wars continue. It all comes down to money. So there's all sorts of debate you could actually have in terms of politics, in terms of how war works, in terms of capitalism. It actually works at a very deep level if you choose to take it that way, or it's just a story where lots of people die because they can't make peace.
And interestingly, actually, that the American sports tend to work that way, don't they? They tend to be that they don't allow any of the individual teams to sort of get all of the money or to take all the best players, whereas actually the Premier League that I was thinking about is the opposite way around. I mean, basically money talks in that one. So yeah, perhaps the fact that it has that American source means that it's a bit more nuanced and a bit more complex.
Yeah, Australia puts caps on players as well, so a team can have so much money which you can pay, and therefore they can't afford to have all the top players, because this is their cap that they can spend on players. And
Sure.
Once you hit 2 players, then you need to spend the rest on lower players. So that cap level actually evens out the teams. And it makes the sport so much more watchable, because you actually don't know who's going to win. It actually comes down to skill and the coaching.
Yeah.
Now, I've been looking down because I'm looking at my copy of Big Finish Companion, and here it says, as one of the trivia points, Philip, it says there that the play was announced on the Big Finish website as a 3 CD release by Seinfeld writer Darrin Henry, who also counts The Muppets Tonight's Grosse Pointe and Futurama amongst his writing credits. This will be a 5th Doctor Story entitled Game Time, so that was the working title. The story later had a change of tide. So the thing I want to bring out there is that this was originally supposed to be a 3 CD release, whereas it's a 2 CD release, but it still retains the 5 cliffhangers that we have throughout. What did you think of the 6-part format? Because it was about 18 to 20 minutes was the episode length, so you could get 3 episodes in an hour. Did you enjoy that? Did that make the story sort of flow for you, Richard, or did you find the cutting irritating?
I found that the episodes were long enough. I mean, I didn't feel like I was missing anything. So in the end, I guess the question then really is just about the shape of the story. Would you try and get rid of one of those cliffhangers and turn it into a 4-parter? And I suppose once it's been written with 5 peaks in the middle, and that's kind of how it's done. So yeah, I mean, I didn't feel like anything was missing from it. It felt like it was the right length for the story. And yeah, I mean, the shape of it obviously was that it had 5 cliffhangers in it. So I guess they did the right thing. Whether the episodes were originally longer and edited down, hard to say.
Phil?
My understanding is it was supposed to be a 6-parter, full-length episodes, and so that's why they needed the 3 discs. And of course, this is the first of 2 6-part stories that Peter Davison gets. Because of the TV run, he never got a 6-parter. The 4 was the longest he ever got, and so Gary deliberately wanted to give him a 6-parter. My understanding is that as the scripts actually did come in, though, there wasn't enough material to sustain, 25 to 30-minute episodes. Or back in that stage, Big Finish was doing more like 40-minute episodes. But I certainly feels like, these episodes are still longer than the Mind Robber, which are 18, 19 minutes long. So I think they're more than long enough, and I actually think that the 6 parts works quite well, and the slightly short episodes actually drives the story a bit faster and actually drives momentum. So to me, it worked really well, and it was nice to get a 6-parter finally for the 5th Doctor. Did you think so too, Darrin?
I agree. I think it worked really well. it seemed much shorter than some 4-parters that had previously come from Big Finish. So, I think it worked well. The cliffhangers were really, it made it sort of flow really nicely throughout the whole time we were listening to it. So
it was a good balance of cliffhangers, because some of them weren't huge, massive cliffhangers, but it was a certain point in the story that just let it roll. And so they weren't all massive, huge, over-the-top cliffhangers, but often with Peter Davison's stories, they weren't. And so I do actually think it actually kept the tone of Davison quite well, and it was just a high point of the story and a good place to end.
I'm not a fan, actually, of the 40-minute episode either on early Big Finishes. It felt to me often that they could have benefited from being edited somewhat. So yeah, I like the tight to storytelling. That works well for me.
Very good. Any final thoughts on the game, or can we move on to our next pick?
Super glad we listened to it, but let's move on.
Okay. All right. So the next story we're going to have a little chat about is a Companion Chronicles, and we know how much you love your Companion Chronicles, Philip. This is called The Anachronauts, written by Simon Guria. It's a First Doctor story starring Jean Marsh and Peter Purves, and I'll read the blurb. An experimental time ship smashes into the TARDIS, and the crews of both ships wake up on a desert island. Has the TARDIS been destroyed? And why doesn't the Doctor want to escape? Then Stephen and Sarah find themselves on the wrong side of the Berlin Wall in 1966, and their only way back to the TARDIS is to betray the Doctor. Here's a trailer.
Coming soon from Big Finish Productions, Doctor Who, The Companion Chronicles, The Anachronauts.
It's a desert island.
Something on the edge of my perception, watching our every step.
The time sprite glared at us with huge black eyes, her skin shimmering as if made of silver.
The universe is big enough for anything to be possible. Impossible! It's impossible! Nothing could stop the wall of noise. It's the Brandenburg Gate.
Then you know where we are.
Berlin, 1966. Behind us, guns and dogs, unseen figures, the sound of their heavy boots on tarmac. We didn't even know what we were running from. Unthinkable! History used like a gun!
Subscribers get more at bigfinish.com.
The Anachronauts, the facts and the trivia. It's written by Simon Guria, directed by Ken Bentley, sound design and music by Toby Frackett Robinson. I think I pronounced it badly. Husek Robinson. I must practice his name. Starring Peter Purves and Jean Marsh. Recorded August 2011, not released till January 2012. The story takes place during the Dalek Master Plan, immediately after the Christmas episode, The Feast of Stephen. Once a year, the Companion Chronicles did a special 2-disc story. This was as a reward to subscribers and encouraged people to subscribe to the entire series. Each individual episode, unlike most stories, is given an individual title, just like the Williams stories did back in the 60s until the Gunfighters. The event on the second CD, although back in time for the listener, was happening concurrent with the events that the story would have been recorded had it been recorded back in 65. The writer wrote a part of another female character, expecting Lisa Bowerman to play her when she directed it, but due to work, she was unavailable to direct. And so Ken Bentley was brought in, and this is only the second Companion Chronicle directed by Ken Bentley.
Very good. So, Richard, what are your experiences with the Companion Chronicles? Have you heard many?
I haven't heard many. I have heard some. But yeah, I guess I tended to focus on the monthly range. And then on the box sets when they came out, the things like Gallifrey and all the Daleks and Cybermen stuff, and then latterly the McGann box sets really blew me away. So I think Companion Chronicles generally were one thing too many, but I'm really glad that you asked me to listen to this one because I've enjoyed it, and I think there's about 2 or 3 minutes at the start of listening to it, and it's happened I listened to the Jaeger and Lightfoot one years ago as well, where the style of storytelling, where there's a lot of narrative, feels a bit jarring compared with the rest of Big Finish. But actually, after 2 or 3 minutes, you just forget that. You get into the story, and it doesn't become a problem. So yeah, it's just there's a little slight push required to get over that particular issue, and then I found this one quite compelling.
Yeah. So normally there is a guest actor in the Companion Chronicles, isn't there, Philip? So
it's always a companion and usually a second actor. There's I think 3 in total that only use one actor, but generally speaking, it's the companion and one other guest cast member. Yeah,
I thought this story was really nice in that the way it set up where it was placed, because I think was it O Tannenbaum that was playing, so you could tell it was set directly after Feast of Stephen. If you're a fan of the Dalek's Master Plan, that is the point. And even at the end, it's sort of placed exactly between the Feast of Stephen and whatever the next episode is. I can't remember what it's called, but it's also interesting. Sorry,
Volcano. I think Volcano's next.
Yeah. So it was interesting, Philip, that you mentioned that the episodes had individual titles. I didn't notice that because I downloaded it and listened to it on my phone. So what were the episode titles?
The Island, The Door, The Wall, Betrayer.
Very good. Okay, so give us your thoughts on the story, Richard.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. It was quite unexpected. I mean, I think the nature of this sort of story from Big Finish is always a bit more fantastic. The full cast ones are generally, I think, a bit more down to earth. And I think that I mean, I'm saying this not having listened to many Companion Chronicles, but my experience of listening to them is that generally this sort of story, they tend to go more for the fantastic. And I thought actually Simon Guerrier had done a good job of not straying too far away, so that a lot of the stuff that happened was sort of within the realm of stuff that might happen. You sort of didn't feel like, oh, this is obviously fantasy, although that's going somewhere in the end. So yeah, it sort of felt realistically like the sort of thing that could have happened in the First Doctor era, because there are experimental stories there. There's things like Celestial Toy Room or Toy Maker, and so on. So yeah, it didn't, and I suppose censor rights and so on. It didn't feel like two way out, and. Yeah, again, I think the fact that it changed location a couple of times, and you got to hear the story from both characters' viewpoints. I thought I thought that was nice. So yeah, it wasn't at all a struggle to listen to it. It flowed nicely, and I enjoyed it.
What's your thoughts on Peter Purves switching between narrator, then Stephen, then the Doctor, all in the same scene? Did you find that easy enough to listen to? Not jarring at all?
Yeah, I mean, it didn't. It wasn't a problem. I settled in quite easily to his First Doctor. I mean, I've heard Fraser Hines doing his Patrick Troughton, and again, the first couple of lines you think, oh, that's that's Peter doing his First Doctor impression, and then actually after that, you just got to get used to, okay, well, that's how they're doing the First Doctor, and it's close enough to be fine. It's not an impersonation, but actually, I mean, in many ways, it's a surprise to me that Peter Purves remembers enough of that to get it right. But it does feel like he's sort of got the spirit of the First Doctor right. And as you say, it's 3 different styles of talking, but he's a good enough actor that doesn't become a problem, I'd say.
You're right. He does have the spirit of William Hartnell. Philip and I both thought that for a long time. Do you remember hearing this for the first time, Philip?
I do. Unlike Richard, the Companion Chronicles is actually one of my favourite series that Big Finish produced. I'm still bitter and sad that they ended it. because I don't think any series has been as creative with Doctor Who stories as the Companion Chronicles, because every single disc is different and unique, and the writers have just brought in so many different components that you never know what you're going to get, and it's totally experimental, and it just, it gives the classic companions and actors amazing opportunities to do great work. So really, it is extraordinary that Peter Purves is such an amazing actor, and it's a great tragedy, I think, to British television that he didn't end up more of a star than he did. Because aside from Doctor Who, he didn't do a lot of acting work after that. He became Blue Peter host, and he does stuff for dog shows, and so he became much more presenter. But when he actually acts, you see he's an astounding actor with an amazing feel for parts and lines. We had the great privilege of interviewing him and talking to him, and seeing the preparation he puts into his work is just amazing. And he is still so sharp and so with it that, once again, it's a great pleasure that there's not more stuff coming out from Peter Purves at the moment from Big Finish, and for goodness sake, Big Finish, more Peter Purves. And then you combine him with, is Jean Marsh Oscar nominated? I know she's an Emmy winner. And she's appeared in Oscar-nominated films. I mean, Jean Marsh is the most astounding career, both in wonderful roles. She's just such an amazing actress in terms of, and just a brilliant lady in terms of the role she created for Upstairs, Downstairs. So you put the two of them together, and you have these amazing, breathtaking performances. Because fortunately, they both got to be in the same room together, playing off each other, and they each lift each other's performances. And so you have two of the most amazing performances in this story. Now, both of them have done, before this, some Companion Chronicles, some trilogies. Both trilogies written by Simon Guria as well. The Jean Marsh one, go and listen to it. It is astounding, and talk about experimental and out there, and it's bizarre.
That is one I have heard, Philippa. Yeah, that is great.
Her first trilogy, and how, because it's set after the Dalek Master Plan, after she's dead. And how on earth can Jean Marsh be doing this trilogy? And then you listen to this trilogy of stories, and it all makes sense. And Simon Guria has done the most amazing job with these stories in terms of Jean Marsh and Peter Purves as well. So, love Companion Chronicles. This is a more traditional Companion Chronicles in some ways. I think the science fiction first couple of episodes work really well. It's a bit like Inside the Spaceship in some ways, in terms of even with the food machine and some of the things that they pull out for the first Doctor era are interesting there. The way that you have a whole story told, narrated by Stephen, and then narrated by Jean Marsh's character, Sarah Kingdom, but the same story being told through different eyes, and you even have the same dialogue happening in the background, which is what I laugh about, because they do exactly the same lines, but the narration is different for both sides. So there's some amazingly interesting stuff that they do in the first series, in the first two episodes. When they then moved to Berlin in the 1960s, one of the novels I had to study for my HSC was The Spy Who Came In From the Cold by John le Carré. And so that whole image of Berlin and the black and whiteness and the bleakness, to me, Smiley, I think it's Smiley in that. I forget who the main character is in John le Carré's novels. I think Smiley's not one of the main ones. But the whole need to escape over the wall, get over the wall, the bleakness of that side, to me, that just brings back all my studies from year 12. And, Doctor's Companion without the Doctor, because the Doctor's missing for those, basically from those two episodes. It really puts them in a more volatile position. How do you survive without the Doctor? Who's going to come and rescue you? He's on the other side of the wall. He can't come there. We have to look after ourselves. And so it raises the whole threat level. So you can probably tell I enjoyed it. Do I sound like I've enjoyed it?
Yeah.
Right,
tell us what you didn't.
think?
Tell us what you didn't like about it, Philip. No, I really enjoyed this story. You're right. The Companion Chronicles is very experimental, and that's why I wish I had more time, because I haven't heard every single one of them. I've heard lots of them, but not not as half as many as I'd want to. I've got them all there waiting, so I'm hoping that the Randomoid Selectatron just keeps throwing them up at us because it makes me listen to them, just like you, Richard, with your Doctor Who. Except in my case, I haven't heard them at all, so it's fresh for the first time when I hear stories like this. Can't remember if I feel like I've heard this one before, but I don't think I had before this.
So, what's your impression coming fresh to it?
What was standing out to me was the music and sound design, because, we know Lisa Bauman did most of these. This is not Lisa Bauman, this is Ken Bentley. And they've both got different styles, and particularly in the music. And there was a music that was going through the desert island scenes that was like constant. It was constantly there. It was almost drone-like in some areas. Almost like what the kind of music or new age type music that you get while you're having a massage, and it all turns out in the end and that is precisely why it's there, because that's where the story goes in the end. Do you know even in the sound design in the jungle there was were they whipbirds, Philip? They're Australian birds.
It did sound like they were whipbirds. I was thinking that when I was listening to it.
I thought that's very Australian. So I don't know if there's birds that sound like that anywhere else in the world. Have you ever heard birds like that before, the whip ones, Richard?
No.
Yeah. I'll claim that. I'll claim that one for the Aussies then.
Yeah.
So that was good. And then when they got to Berlin, the music changed, and it had that sort of
sinister.
It's or cinematic. I can't say Wagner because that was 20 years earlier, but it was, you could get that through the music there as well, similarly. And the sound design for the streets of Berlin, I can see the image behind you there, Philip. That is what I saw in my head with the aid of that sound design and music. So I think it worked beautifully. And that's probably my favourite part of this story. One other thing I wanted to mention was
Just before we go on, it would have been a very different story, and I would love to have a copy where Lisa Bauman directed it.
Because that would have been fascinating.
It would have been a very different story.
Yep.
Because she would have been playing Mags. Was that the character? So the part was actually written for her to play, and so she would have been playing the evil captain in the whole story. That would have changed things considerably. There would have been, as you said, hardly any musicscape at all, and the richness of lines would have been emphasised. There would have been more pause. It actually would have been a bit longer because she would have created a lot more pause with the characterizations. And so I would love to hear a Lisa Bauman version as well, but I'm so glad we got
the Lisa Bauman cut. That's what we need.
It'd be fascinating. I don't think Jean Marsh still with us. I'm not sure she's well.
She is, but she's not well.
She's not well.
Yeah. So sorry, Richard.
Well, I was just going to come back on something that Philip mentioned a little while ago. So Peter Purves is, I'd say, a big name in the UK, but I agree with you. Nobody would know that he was an actor. He's very famous for all of this presenting stuff. So much so that he appeared on one of the buses for the Platinum Jubilee last year. So he's a big name, but nobody would know. And equally, I mean, Jean Marsh, of course, is a big name that everyone would know was an actress. So you put those two together, I think Doctor Who fans obviously would know exactly what's going on, but you give that to an average member of the UK public, they'd be a bit kind of surprised if it would feel a bit chalk and cheese to them.
You were going to make another point before I rudely cut you off before, Dwayne.
Oh, that's right. Yes. Talking about violence in the last story of the game. I mean, this was nowhere near as violent, but there was one scene in there that really stuck out to me as quite horrific. The scene where Sarah fell off the top of a mountain at one point, and that was really jolting and jarring. But I think it served the story well because you can sort of dismiss it because of the way the story goes. But it really affected me at the time. I thought that was done really well. Did you pick up on that too, Philip?
Yeah, I did. And it's because the whole dealing with a broken arm, and I mean, Stephen gets shot too. So there is actually quite a bit of violence that actually happens to the companions. And then you've got torture scenes and etc. in East Berlin. So yeah, it doesn't pull punches in terms of storytelling.
It feels like there aren't many companions that could have gone through that. I mean, the Sarah character is perfect because she's space agent. I mean, whatever that means, but you kind of believe that she'd be able to grit her teeth and get on with stuff in a way that a lot of other companions would struggle.
Yeah, in some ways, it would have been interesting again to explore even further her in East Berlin, because certainly early characterization-wise, that was her character. She was very much the fascist police officer, and didn't explore that side as much as I thought it could have done. And I was kind of hoping it would have gone there, but it's already doing so much. I guess that would have been another step, maybe a step too far.
It's interesting. It goes into Mechanus instead, and Stephen's experience of being stuck in the cell there. So I suppose at least they've gone into one of the characters' past.
Yes, indeed.
What did you think of the cover art, Philip? Because there's an image there of, is that the time sprite?
I was trying to work out for myself what that image was, and the only thing I could assume it was the time sprite, but that's certainly not the image I had in my head of the time sprite.
When you're listening, yeah, it doesn't.
When I'm listening,
no, not as skeletal as what's in your head when you're listening to it. It's a bit more, not as skeletal. I think that's it.
It talks about black eyes or dark eyes, but it doesn't talk about, as you say, a skeleton for a face.
It's a wonderful piece of art. Again, and I love how they use the black and white. I mean, I guess they haven't got that many images of Stephen or Sarah to use. We've got Clayton who colorized, but just using the black and white against a very bright color background actually makes the cover really pop. So I do think that the cover works really well. It's certainly engaging. I don't think it actually is 100% connected to the story, but it does draw you into want to listen, which is, I guess, what a cover's supposed to do, because you can't tell an audio by its cover.
I just think the time sprite wasn't in the story as much as the cover seems to indicate it will be. That was my impression of that.
Yeah, it's a bit Indiana Jones, the Temple of Doom, for me.
Yeah, for sure. Any final thoughts, guys, on the Anachronauts that I've missed?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't watched or listened to maybe a huge number of Simon Guerrier stories, but I particularly like this one, and I think it's really quite thoughtful. I mean, I suppose my only caveat is that my wife is a primary school teacher, and she specialises in English, and she says that the one thing that happens in the stories that children write that sort of makes us sigh is when they say, "And it was all a dream," and it feels like he pulls that plot twist twice in the same story. But having said all that, it's nicely seeded, and it feels like it does enough to get away with it. So I'll give him a pass on it, even if it is a familiar story trope.
I have to admit that I was thinking similar things, but yes, equally, I give him a pass too, for sure, on that one. Excellent.
Listen to it.
Absolutely. All right, that is it for our thoughts. Let's go and see what Simon Guria himself remembers about the Anachronauts.
Listen, Simon, thanks for joining us and talking about the Anachronauts. Can you start off by telling us how you got commissioned for this job?
It's a long time ago, so I've had to look up my old emails. And it turns out it's all Tom Baker's fault. Big Finish in 2010, 2011 had signed Tom Baker to do audio, which was all very exciting. And that meant that John Dorney was really taken up with all of that. And he was supposed to be writing a 2-disc companion chronicle for Gene Marsh and Peter Purvis. I think that's who he was going to write it for. And it became clear that he was too taken up with the Tom Baker stuff, but also Gene Marsh was appearing in the TV revival of Upstairs, Downstairs. And there was another series of that on the books. So her agent had let us know that she was not going to be available. So a script needed to be delivered by a certain date. John was not going to be able to deliver it on that certain date. So David Richardson, the producer, said to me, "How fast can you write a script?"
And how fast did you write the script?
So that conversation was happening in the first 2 weeks of April 2011, and I had delivered a locked off script, having done notes and everything, by the middle of July, and we recorded it the 3rd and 4th
of August.
Yeah.
Isn't it true though, Simon, that you had some trouble about 2/3 of the way through this with deleting some of it?
Yeah. So I had a Word template that I used all the time that recognized script format. So if you wrote a character's name, it would recognize, and a colon, it would recognize that as a character. And then if you started writing that again, it would auto-complete it for you. And what that meant was that I could rattle through a draft of the script much quicker. And I'd used that for years. And when I changed laptops, I just copied the same template across, and it didn't work. So what I discovered quite a long way into the Anachronauts was, although I could see the words on the screen as I was typing them, when I saved them, the document was empty and there was nothing in it. And if I tried to copy and paste anything from the document, it didn't go anywhere. It just, a bit like on, websites that secure their content, and you try and copy and paste something and it just comes out as blank. So, and I was about 3/4 of the way through the script, I think, and realized that nothing was there. Now I would have attempted some other things like screenshotting and then, seeing if it could be recognized in that. But I just had this weird sort of thing, knowing that time was tight, that I couldn't get to the document at all. And in trying to salvage it and get into it, I lost it all and ended up with just a blank document. So I had to rewrite it from scratch with very little time, which was not a great time for me. I found that really hard, because part of the thing you're doing when you're writing a script is you're working it out for yourself and how it all fits, and there's a bit of excitement about that. Having to type it out again, I just had no love for it at all, and was just a bit miserable about it all, really. And it's the oddest thing. It's the only thing I'm pretty good at backing up, but that's the only time that has happened. It affected another file, but I wasn't nearly so anywhere of the way through. So it's odd. I think probably the script as produced benefited from that, because it meant I'd got everything straight in my head one time already. So the version I wrote was a more simplified and there was more clarity to it. So I think that was quite good. I've since discovered that Robert Louis Stevenson had something similar happen with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which he gave to his wife to read, and she put it on the fire because she thought it was horrible. And I kind of feel that, I'm now part of an exclusive club, me and Robert Louis Stevenson, like mates, having gone through this experience. But yeah, I don't know. It was, I did kind of go to David Richardson and go, is there any chance of any more time? I'm sad and miserable, or more sad and more miserable than I usually am writing. And I looked at the email earlier, and he said, well, normally, yes, but Jean Marsh has been nominated for an Emmy and needs to record this before she goes out to LA, which is for the award ceremony, which, as reasons to get the writing done, that's quite a good one. That was quite a motivating factor.
So in terms of the Companion Chronicles, you've written a lot of Companion Chronicles. You've written a lot for both Jean Marsh and Peter Purves, and taken them on pretty specific journeys along the way. I think this is one of the first double discs that was done. How come it was decided to do a double disc?
I don't know. That was something that had already been decided when I did it. When I was brought on, the idea was that we would get Jean in for one day and Peter in for one day. I don't think the plan, from what I can see in the email, I mean, I wasn't really involved in the kind of logistics of it, but my sense of it was that they didn't expect to get both actors in on the same day. So I had to write it in a way that one disc was narrated by one of them with interjections from the other, and vice versa. But the main concern for me is I'd already written a trilogy for Sarah Kingdom and a trilogy for Stephen Taylor. So what else was there I could possibly say about, what could I bring to it? So that was a bit of a concern. So while I was writing them, I reread John Peel's novelizations of the Dalek Master Plan. Just look, because I'd kind of gone into the TV episodes so much with the trilogies I'd done, just looking for anything I could kind of pick up on or stuff. And he had some stuff about their relationship, which I just, nicked. And kind of used that as a hook for what I was writing. But actually, when we came to the studio, Jean and Peter were together, so that worked really well.
Does that explain the switching of the main sort of narratives? Like, so Stephen's in sort of doing the main narration side of it for the first and third episode, and then Sarah's doing it for the second and fourth. That was specifically because you thought they weren't going to be there together?
Yeah. I think that was definitely why I wrote it that way. I don't know whether there's nothing I can see specifically, but I vaguely remember a conversation, which was that I think they thought the chances of getting them both on the same day were a bit remote because both of them are quite in demand and busy. And so logistically, we might have to do them separately, or that was the expectation. So they had to be. You didn't want too much crossfire, sort of dialogue heavy scenes between the two. So there was a bit more narration, a bit more, and that also meant separating them as well, and that kind of stuff. So there's a bit of interaction, but not as much as I might have gone with otherwise.
So where did the idea for the story come from? There's sort of two stories, actually.
Yeah. So the first half is set on a desert island. And I'd had that idea in various forms going back a long way. In about 2001, 2002, Big Finish had an open submissions thing where you could just send ideas for an audio play. And the idea I sent into that before I was writing for Big Finish was about a desert island and odd things happening on a desert island. It wasn't quite the same, but the germ of something was there. The Anachronauts as a title was the original title for what became my first Doctor Who novel, The Time Travellers. And I took The Time Travellers from my friend Johnny Morris, who had included it in a short story he wrote. And it just seemed to fit much better with what I was doing and felt much more of the time for a first Doctor novel. So I think I pitched that kind of idea for the first half. And then the second half, my original idea was set on a spaceship and involved a robot. And David Richardson just thought it was a bit perfunctory. It was a bit straight down the line, really, and he wanted something a bit more interesting, really. So I'd done it because I'd done the Stephen trilogy, which was all about science and rocketry and things. I was thinking I'd do something in history. So I originally suggested doing them meeting Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General, during the English Civil War, which I just, I thought I can watch the movie of that and pick bits out of it. And when David didn't like that. I think they were considering doing something set in the same period, or maybe with him, with that character. I can't remember. And I was kind of, oh, what else can I do? So I scanned over my shelves of DVDs thinking, what can I borrow from? And I spotted the second Harry Palmer film, Funeral in Berlin, and just thought, no, as far as I'm aware, nobody's done a Doctor Who set in Berlin behind the Iron Curtain, and that would be an interesting thing, because it would be of the right time that the episodes would have been made in the 60s. So it would have had a contemporary edge. And what that means is that I can talk about what was happening at the time the program was being made, but also I can talk about it in retrospect as well. And that gives me kind of an in with it. And David liked that. So that's what we did.
Yeah, it was very weird because it felt so embedded in history. One sense it's so long ago, but yet, as you say, it's when the show was being filmed. So you've got this double edge happening, which would have been, fascinating way of doing it. Now, in terms of Jack Rayner, she was a bit scripted. Did the scripted do much? I don't know how much time she would have had to have done much.
Oh yeah, I got extensive notes from Jack, as always. So she was involved in all of the ones that I wrote. She was involved at the storyline stage. So I'd picture what would generally happen is I'd get given a broad idea of what they were looking for. Can you do a space story? Can you do a historical story? It's this character, it's this companion. Maybe, can you do something different? We've just done a story like this. Can you do something that's different, or whatever? I would then generally pitch a sort of paragraph idea. Just, how about this? How about that? All a bit informal. There'd be a bit back and forth just to get a rough idea of what David was after. I'd then write a storyline, which is generally page and a half, 2 pages of just, the beginning, the middle, and the end. What do you need to know? That would go to Jack, and there'd then be a bit of discussion over that. Once that had been okayed, the storyline would need to be formatted for approval by the BBC, and they might have notes, or suggestions, or just be aware you can't have people being shot in the head if you're doing a story about Berlin, that kind of stuff. Then I'd go away and write it, and David and Jack would give me notes on scripts, and it goes through as many drafts until everybody's happy. Jack's concerns with Anachronauts is that it's odd. It's an odd kind of, it's not, nothing about it is straightforward. Nothing about it is quite what it seems. So her concern were things like the clarity of it. Are the explanations in the right place? Are the explanations thorough enough that when, it's fine to be lost in the bits where you're meant to be lost in as a listener, but when there's the explanations, are there enough of them? Are they clear enough for everybody to know where they are? She was concerned too about whether I was cheating in the second half by having a character who's an unreliable narrator, basically, which is it's a kind of convention in certain types of thriller, but you have to play by the rules, and she felt the first version I was doing was cheating too much, so that got revised. And in revising that, in her raising questions about those sorts of things, that cued me up to think about. So one of the things that came in quite late in the day is that how can I do this without spoiling it too much? Stephen asks the Doctor what he dreams about at one point, and that whole sequence came very late in the day as a result of something Jack raised elsewhere in the script. So in her asking the questions, it clarified my ideas about the play as a whole.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the things I really enjoy about it is the last 10 or 15 minutes of the part one, told through Stephen's narration, is then retold almost identically through was going to say Gene Martin, we should consider the character Sarah's narration. So you've actually got the same scenes through very different eyes, and yet playing out at similar timing schedules. How much of that have you planned out before you did it, or you just say you did? Because I guess the act one is all what's happened to Sarah, and then you tell Sarah's story. How much of that had you thought through before you did it?
When I knew that I was going to have both actors, but not necessarily on the same day, I thought there was originally going to be a lot more of that kind of repetition in it as a whole. And as you say, I thought you could tell the same events through different eyes and see different things and then picking up on different things. But also that idea that you could lay, I was kind of thinking in terms of a thriller of you need to, what Ben Aronovich refers to as laying the pipe work for later in the story. And I thought you could layer some of the clues from one of their perspective, but not the other. There's an amazing bit in No Country for Old Men where the killer uses a particular way to kill someone, and the cop is kind of his subconscious. He's just chatting about something completely different. And there's a bit where he kind of just, his conversation wanders, his mind wanders, and he refers to the thing that's been used as a murder weapon. And then he kind of looks a bit confused and he goes, I don't know why I'm talking about that. And his subconscious has just put it all together, but he doesn't make the connection, but the audience realizes that he's on the case, which I think is an amazing bit of writing. And I was kind of, I'm not sure whether I'd seen that at that point, but that was the kind of idea that the different perspectives would give you a different way of kind of resolving the story. And also I had picked up from John Peel that this kind of love triangle or unresolved love story thing that Stephen had feelings that Sarah didn't reciprocate or whatever. I realized that was how I could get that into the story, so that it would mean something different for them. And also that's how he knows things that are happening in the second half of the story are not quite what they appear. So I kind of had that I must have had that fairly early on because I hooked the whole thing on it. So
one thing that stood out to me for this in terms of, the sound was two things. I think this might have been Ken Bentley's first Companion Chronicles.
His second.
Second, was it? So Lisa Bauman was doing lots of them, and she's very minimal when it comes to music in the Companion Chronicles in particular. But in this story, with Toby Robinson doing the music and sound design, there was this kind of constant atmospheric, dreamy style sound that I could hear all the way through that it made me think, oh, this is different. But by the end of the story, obviously all that's made sense because that kind of sound design fit in perfectly with your story. How much direction do you give in your script for things like that, the sound design and special effects, for instance?
I usually am trying to think when I'm writing it, what is this going to sound like? Where are they that gives it a distinctive sound? So when I did Home Truths is basically somebody telling you a ghost story, and there's a person telling you the story, and then you cut away and hear the story happening. That was kind of the idea. And the idea was that you've got a narrator and then you are in the haunted house. That was kind of the structure of it. But what I needed was a way to orientate the listener so they know when they're in the house, when they're in the story, and when they're with the narrator. And I puzzled over how I was going to do that. And then I think I was chatting to the sound engineer, Davey Darlington, who wasn't even working on this story, and said this was the problem that I had. And he said, why don't you just have a clock in the background in the room with the narrator? And every time you hear the ticking clock, you'll know you're back in that space, which was brilliant. Absolutely, brilliant, simple thing. And then I was kind of like, well, I can do that in the next one I do in the Drowned World, but also I'm going to set this on a world where there's a sea. So when you hear the lapping of the sea, you're out in the, all of those kind of things. So yeah, I do think about that kind of thing. So the thing about a desert island was I knew there'd be the sea, I knew there'd be the jungle, I knew there'd be all of that kind of stuff. So it'd be quite a distinctive oral kind of experience. And then with Berlin, I was like, oh, I know exactly what this is going to sound like, because it's going to sound, like a rundown city and, or, fog, so that it muffles the sounds and all of that kind of stuff. Beyond that, you're kind of thinking about sound effects beat to beat, and how can you tell a story, and how can you, what you're trying to do is get away from the idea as much as you can that it's two actors in adjacent booths in a little studio. And I'm very conscious of, you've got to disguise that as much as possible. So anything you can do could kind of trigger the senses of the listener, and get them to conjure images. And, so it's not just sounds, it's also smells and textures. So anything like that you can do to kind of get the listener creating a set and creating a world is very important. As for the differences between Lisa and Ken, so I assumed that Lisa Bowerman was going to direct this, as she had all of my Companion Chronicles, which is why I wrote an antagonist who was a woman, Natalie Lang, because I assumed Lisa would play that part. And then Lisa got a gig on the soap opera Coronation Street and was not available within the limited time that we had to record this. So Ken came on, and that had a knock-on effect that he couldn't play Natalie Lang. So my understanding is, I wasn't there for this conversation, but my understanding is that he said to Jean Marsh, as they were setting up, do you do any voices, any other voices other than whatever? And she interpreted what he said as, do you do any impressions? So she said, oh yeah, I can kind of do Greta Garbo. So she played Natalie Lang as Greta Garbo, which is not quite what I'd expected, but is amazing. And I named Natalie Lang after my editor and deputy editor at Doctor Who Adventures, who I was working for at the time, Natalie Barnes and Paul Lang. So I went back to work and kind of said, I've just seen G. Marsh, the Emmy-nominated actress, playing you two in the style of Greta Garbo, which was, amazing. That's kind of one of the things that you don't, as a writer, you can't really anticipate, but it was great. And Ken was really good. He just made it all very easy and had ideas about how it should work. And sometimes when you're sat in the room as the play's going out, as the writer, you're kind of going, oh, I'm not sure about that, or can we go back and just underline that line to make sure, can we just make sure that bit's clear because it's an important plot point? And Ken was on all of that sort of stuff. So I kind of coasted in the background and ate the biscuits and just kept out of the way, really.
So what are you most pleased about with this audio?
Oh, it sounds amazing. Toby Horacek Robinson, who did the sound design, it just sounds so rich and detailed. I think what he's done with Berlin is really convincing, and it's not just that it's got authenticity about it. It feels just really immersive, and I love that. I was looking at the email I sent him after I'd heard it, just going, I was trying to listen to it while I was doing the washing up and stuff, and I had to stop it and pay attention properly, and not do it while I was doing my chores. So I'm really pleased with that. I'm really pleased that we got Peter and Jean to work together. That was really fun. And they were really funny together as well. And Peter was apprehensive to begin with because he'd not done a lot of acting in the past, whatever it was, 30 years. And here he was paired up with a Emmy-nominated actress.
An Emmy winning 35 years earlier. I think she'd won it 35 years earlier.
She had, yes, you're absolutely right. She had previously won an Emmy for Upstairs Downstairs, but while we were recording it, we were all very conscious that she was about to jet off to the States because she'd been nominated again. And the joke was that she'd been nominated for her work in The Drowned World. I have several emails all making the same joke that's what it was for, and that she, she's been nominated for her part as a house. Upstairs, and it's just a misunderstanding with Upstairs Downstairs. They've misunderstood the context. It's not that she was in Upstairs Downstairs. She was a house. But anyway, stupid things that entertain us while we're recording. But she was amazing because the first scene we recorded. So Peter was a little bit nervous, and so I think Ken might have said something to Jean about this. And so the first scene we recorded was a TARDIS scene, and Peter had to do a bit of narration, a bit of the Doctor, a bit of Stephen, and then there's a line from Jean. And my memory is that Peter did bit of narration, bit of Doctor, bit of Stephen, and then there was a silence. And we all kind of like, what's happening? And then Jean Marsh went, I'm so sorry. I was so caught up in what Peter was doing. I completely forgot that I'm in this, which was just perfect because as far, if the Emmy-winning, Emmy-nominated actress says that you've transported her to a story, that's, good enough. And we were off. And it was lovely. And they were really funny together. And it just, and the really important thing when you're doing audio, you don't have a huge amount of time, although there's a bit of chatter and there's a bit of gossip and there's, you have tea breaks and stuff. You do have to get on with it and get through it. And the two of them we just knocked through it fast, because they just know what they're doing and they're really good and they cut sparks and they understood it. So you don't have to keep going back and giving notes and stuff. It was, it was just really, it was like, working with good professional people who just can do the job. It was really satisfying to work on. So that it was nice to kind of coast along in their wake, really.
Fascinating thoughts there from Simon Guria, Philip.
Yeah, he had a lot to say, and he remembered a lot thanks to some emails. But yeah,
it's good when guests remember things.
It does, and I'm looking forward to a fuller, bigger conversation interview with him soon.
Excellent. So am I. All right, so that leaves us only to pick the next two stories for what we like to call...
We've got randomoids.
Ah!
Oh, stop that. Okay, so I've got the randomoid selectatron going, and I'm going to cue the music and spin the wheel. Here we go. Philip, I'm not sure if you're going to like this. I wonder if you will. Tell me if you will. What has come up is two stories immediately. It's a box set, so I'm not going to pick two. This is the only spin of the randomoid selectatron.
Okay.
It is the box set of the novel adaptations, Volume 1, the very first novel adaptations, which is The Romance of Crime and The English Way of Death. So because there's two 4-part stories in there, we'll just review that box set, and that'll be our next randomoid show. So
I remember being very excited when these were coming out, and I remember the lovely cover with Romana on the front. So
it is I'm looking at it right now, it is a very lovely cover. And there's a picture of the Ogron as well from The Romance of Crime, and I think the Ogron was something I remember like physically shaking with laughter with the performance of that Ogron in that story. So I'm looking forward to going back.
I can't remember that, but okay, I look forward to it. John Dorney playing the Ogron. I've got a feel vague in
let me have I have to know now, who was that? Because I don't think John Coleshaw was around at the time. What was the name of the Ogron?
You got a name? Not just Ogron?
I can't remember.
no complications.
There's funny named characters in there, but I wouldn't like to.
Is John Donnie in there? The cast is?
No.
Oh, okay. It wasn't John Donnie then.
Oh, Michael Troughton's in there.
Oh,
I think he might be in the English Way of Death. It's one of these ones where all the cast is mixed up.
I can't stand them doing that.
Come on, Big Finish.
Stop
Come on.
doing it.
Split up your cast list with these box
Cast up
sets.
the right stories. I'm enough trouble working out who people are, let alone combining stories together.
All right, so that's going to be our next Randomoids. Thank you so much, Richard, for joining us. It's been a pleasure to have your company.
Well, it's very kind of you to invite me. And I mean, in view, I guess, of all the star acts you get on this podcast, I have to say I've been impressed by two things. I mean, in the time since I last appeared on this podcast, one is the way that you've made yourself, the go-to place to go to listen to opinions and views about Big Finish, and I've enjoyed listening to many of your episodes along the way. But and I suppose in the same fashion, then the number of people who've beaten a path to your door. I mean, I don't kid myself. I'm sure you've done a very impressive job of talking, persuading, cajoling, and encouraging people to come and join you. But it's been great. You've had some very interesting and in-depth conversations. So yeah, I applaud you for that, and it's great to be able to join you again. And I hope that one or two people will listen to this episode with my thoughts.
Maybe two. There could be two.
We think you're just as special as our other guests, Richard. We don't judge our guests. And
I tell you what, some of our guests would not be able to talk about the stories like you've talked about the stories with us, and sometimes that's fun too.
Sometimes our guests don't even realise they've been in some stories.
That's right. That's right. And actually, this month has been 3 years since the podcast started. So I guess, relatively speaking, it's not a long time, but sometimes it feels like a long time, Philip.
It does sometimes feel like a long time.
But we're still going strong, so that's good. So thank you. But what I would like to do is maybe give a recommendation to our listeners of something that we've been listening to. Now, because, Richard, you're the guest, I'd love you to go first, but that is not possible because it is Philip's turn.
Because I'm a selfish twat that no matter what happens has to always go first. I'm going to recommend something that came out last month. It took me a while to get to it because I've been having to listen to so many other things. We have so much we've got to listen to sometimes. But it came out last month, and it's the Diary of River Song, Series 11, Friend of the Family.
I haven't heard this yet, but I've heard that it's fantastic.
It is wonderful. So, I mean, I love River Song anyway. Some of her box sets are amazing, and she has some standout stories. This is just one story, though, of 4 discs, all written by
Tim Foley, isn't it?
Tim Foley. And so it's one continuous story. It's got a small cast, all set in one house, but over 4 time zones. And it says River popping backwards and forwards. But Isla Bear, Wendy Craig, Mark Elstrop, Fidelity Nash, it's just the cast are just astounding and they're amazing. And it's just, it is enthralling, it is funny, you don't really know what's going on, it slowly builds up and unwinds itself. I would recommend don't listen to all the extras to the end, not because they put spoilers in, but it just spoils the flow of the narrative. I don't know why Big Finish is doing this. Big Finish, once again, all your interviews and things, put them at the very end when it's one story. Don't put 20 minutes of extras at the end of a story. It's breaking the flow. But it is just 4 hours of very clever, timey-wimey relationships and a slow unveil. So you're expecting lots of action, you're not going to get it. In this, it's not an action story. It's not hugely exciting or dramatic. So it is dramatic, but it's not powerful. But it's just this story of a family told through different perspectives, through different actors, depending on the age of the actor, bit by bit being revealed. It is a brilliant piece of work, and I'm so glad I've been listening to it. It's kept me enthralled for hours. So that's my recommendation.
I think it's going to have to be next on my list.
All right. Yeah, you'll love it. It's amazing.
Okay. Richard, have you got anything? Doesn't have to be Doctor Who related. Anything you've been listening to that you would like to recommend? It could be your own podcast and you've got not just Something Who, but you've got another podcast too, haven't you?
Yes. So I've got If It's Hurting, It's Not Working podcast about work. I mean, that has been on hiatus for a while, but I am hoping to relaunch it with a new co-host. So I guess keep your ears open and maybe something like that will come along. I think
your previous co-host, it was hurting too much.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, I guess is the answer. We had a conversation about it, and she has got a lot going on in her life right now, and she felt like a podcast was one thing too many. And I mean, all of us, I'm sure, has felt a little bit like that at times. But
I feel that way every week.
We love our podcasts so much that we just can't bear to be separated. So even though it does hurt at times, we sort of grit our teeth and go through the pain. So I mean, Emily co-devised the format with me, and was very instrumental in it. But she's kind of sensibly looked at what she's doing and said, no, that's one thing too many. So I'm hoping to get another co-host for that, and maybe launch in the next month or two. So that's something that's ongoing. I mean, I'm listening to stuff all the time, but perhaps the thing I'd recommend for listeners of this is my friend Paul Morris and his Jago and Lightfoot Forever. I mean, it's a while since I listened to it, but I just thought that was such a great ending to the Jago and Lightfoot series, and I have listened to that so many times. It's all of the series. I think it's one of the highlights of Big Finish for me, and it was disappointing, I guess, when that came to an end. So being able to hear a satisfying conclusion to it was great, and I thought they did it in the only way that they could, but it worked really well.
Yeah, it's a wonderful series. That's a brilliant ending to a great series. And of course, the entire series of Jago and Lightfoot only came about because of Companion Chronicles.
Yeah,
because it was a Companion Chronicle they did, and it was just so well done, so well received. We got 11 wonderful box sets.
So it was 14 actually.
Oh, you're right. Sorry, yes, you're right. There were 13
full cast, and the 14th was audiobooks.
That's right.
We were talking to your podcast co-host Paul Morris, who a long time before that came out, he said that Series 14 had been written, and we said, "Oh, what, are they going to do something with it?" And he was very tight-lipped about it at the time, and it was great to hear that season finally come out and get those stories. It was an interesting way to listen to it. Yeah, it was different, but great. All right.
What are you, Dwayne? What are you going to recommend for us?
Well, I'm going to recommend something that you recommended something you were listening to that was released last month. I'm going to recommend something that for us here in Australia was released last night, and that is The Ninth Doctor. Shades of Fear is the latest box set with Christopher Eccleston.
You listened to that already?
Yeah, I listened to most of it. I've just started on the third story, so I've listened to the first two stories. Lizzie Hopley does the opening story, and you've got James Kettle. Now, I know you like the way James Kettle writes, and if you like his way of writing, he does it again in this one.
Did you cry, Dwayne?
No, I didn't cry, but he was injecting a fair bit of comedy into this one this time, because he is a comedy writer, so normally he puts his emotional stories in there, but he's injected a fair bit of comedy, but with a bit of emotion too.
Lovely.
And love monsters again. So I'm yet to hear the third one, which is in full, which is a Vashta Narada story. So that will be interesting to hear. So more than a recommendation, because I haven't formed a complete opinion on it yet, but it's what I've been listening to today.
Yeah, and I'm loving The Ninth Doctor. So great to have him.
Oh, he's just perfect. He's just like he hasn't left. He's a very, very, for whatever reason, he's decided to do Big Finish. Well, I think like a lot of actors, they come to Big Finish, try it out, and then learn to love it. I think, or not learn to love it, but come to love it. He's the same. Because the first episode's with Frank Skinner. So Frank Skinner, I think he's far better known in the UK than here. I never heard of him until Mummy on the Orient Express, where where everyone was saying, "Oh, it's Frank Skinner." So I thought, who is this guy? But what I love about Frank Skinner is that he loves Doctor Who so much. And when someone who is such a big fan as well as an actor, just like David Tennant, I guess, get into their roles in Doctor Who, in the Doctor Who universe, it just adds that sort of something real special. And that's what Frank Skinner brings to this part in the Ninth Doctor set. So that's what I'm listening to.
He's a very warm character as well, Frank Skinner.
He is, yeah. That comes across.
Yeah.
All right, so with all that said and done, thank you once again, Richard. Appreciate it.
Yes, thanks, Richard.
Cheers.
And thank you, Philip.
Thank you, Dwayne.
We'll catch you all next time. This has been the Sirens of Audio episode 145, Randomoids 18, with our guest Simon Guerrier and your hosts Philip Edney, Dwayne Bunny, and our guest host from the Something Who podcast, Richard Smith. Original theme music composed by Joe Kramer. Our website is sirensofaudio.com. You can email us at sirensofaudio@gmail.com or contact us via any one of our socials. Thanks for listening, audiophiles. We'll hear you next time.